Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into a really fascinating time in Japanese history, the Genroku era.
That's right. Think late 17th, early 18th century, a period of, well, real cultural blossoming.
Absolutely. And it's particularly interesting because of the rise of the merchant class, isn't it? We're going to explore what made the culture tick, the thought, the arts, even just daily life.
It's a period that feels incredibly vibrant. So, Genroku, roughly the 1680s to the early 1700s, it's often seen as a real high point for culture in the early Edo period.
And why then? What set the stage?
Stability, mostly. The
Oh.
Tokugawa shogunate had established peace after centuries of conflict, and that peace dividend, if you will, allowed for, well, other things to flourish.
Like culture and the economy.
Yeah.
And the merchants you mentioned.
Exactly. With peace came trade, and merchants, particularly in places like Kyoto and Osaka, the Kamigata region, they got quite wealthy.
Okay, so they had the money.
They had the money, and they became major patrons. They really started shaping the cultural scene. And they had this philosophy, this idea of enjoying the present, the floating world.
Ukiyo. I've heard that term. It sounds almost hedonistic.
Well, yes and no. It was definitely about enjoying the pleasures of life theater, art, fashion. But it wasn't necessarily a complete rejection of everything else. It was more of a focus on the here and now, this vibrant city life.
And you also mentioned realism.
Yes, alongside the vibrancy, there's this growing sense of realism. You see it in intellectual discussions and definitely in the arts, a focus on depicting the world as it was.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift to the intellectual side. Neo-Confucianism, that sounds important for this era. What exactly was it?
It really became the dominant philosophy for learning, especially the Shushi school. Its big emphasis was on order, hierarchy, social roles, lord and retainer, father and son, making sure everyone knew their place.
Which sounds like something the government would approve of.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. The shogunate and the domain lords strongly supported it. They saw it as a tool for social stability, for legitimizing their rule.
How did they promote it?
Well, they appointed scholars. Hayashi Razan was a key figure in Edo. He set up a Confucian temple, which later moved and became the Taiseidan, basically the center of official learning.
The Taisen, right?
And Shogun Tsunayoshi, who was quite scholarly himself, even gave lectures there. That tells you how important it was considered.
Wow, the shogun lecturing. So was Shushi the only game in town, intellectually speaking?
Not entirely. There were other Neo-Confucian schools, and you had figures like Yamazaki Ansai who tried to blend Confucianism with Shinto. That was called Suka Shinto.
Oh, blend. Interesting.
Yeah, and then there was Yomei-gaku, based on Wang Yangming's ideas. This school was a bit different. It emphasized intuition and questioning authority sometimes.
Ah, so maybe not as popular with the shogunate.
Exactly. People like Naketoju and Kumazawa Banzan were important proponents, but the shogunate was cautious. It had a reformist edge, you see.
Understood. And then there's this other movement mentioned, Kogaku. Ancient learning, right, Kogaku.
Yeah.
This was basically a reaction against those later Neo-Confucian interpretations,
Right.
like Shushi's. Kogaku scholars said, let's go back to the original text.
Back to Confucius and Mencius themselves.
Precisely. They felt the original meaning had been obscured. Yamaga Soko was a big name here, though he got into trouble for criticizing the Shushi school.
Got into trouble? How so?
He was punished, exiled for a time, but others carried on. Ito Jinsai and his son Togai ran a really influential private school in Kyoto, the Kogito.
A private school for this ancient learning.
Yeah. And in Edo, you had Ogyu Sorai, another major Kogaku figure who founded his own school and even advised the government.
It's quite a lively intellectual scene, even with the official backing for Neo-Confucianism. It wasn't just happening in Edo either, was it? What about the domains?
No, definitely not just Edo. Many regional lords, the daimyo, were big patrons of learning too. Tokugawa Mitsukuni in Mido, for instance, started this massive project.
The Dainihanshi, the Great History of Japan, exactly. A huge undertaking compiling Japan's history. Required immense resources and scholarly effort.
Shows real commitment. Any other examples?
Sure. Maeda Tsunenori in Kaga domain, he collected scholars like Kinoshita Junin and built up a huge library. And some scholars weren't just academics, they were administrators.
Like who?
People like Nonaka Kenzan in Tosa or Kumazawa Banzan, we mentioned him with Yomigaku, he also worked in Okayama. They applied their knowledge to practical things like land development, flood control projects.
So learning had real-world applications.
Absolutely. And it wasn't always just for the elite samurai class. Ikeda Mitsumasa in Okayama actually set up a school, the Shizupani School, that educated commoners as well as samurai.
That's quite progressive for the time.
It really was. And this whole rational, sort of realistic approach you see in Confucian thought, it seems to have spurred interest in other fields too.
Like sciences.
Exactly. Natural sciences, botany, they called it, Hanswagoku medicine, mathematics, astronomy. They all saw progress.
Can you give us an example, maybe in math?
Sure. Seki Takakazu. He made some incredible advances in Japanese mathematics, Wasan. Things like calculating pi, circle area, developing a form of written algebra. Really foundational stuff.
Wow. And astronomy.
Yasui Santetsu, who later became Shibukawa Harumi, he realized the existing calendar, the Senyoreki, was inaccurate. So he studied Chinese astronomy and created a new, much better Japanese calendar, the Jokyo calendar.
That's a huge practical improvement.
It was, and the shogunate recognized it. They made him the very first official astronomer responsible for observations and calendar making.
So a move towards more empirical methods. Did this affect history and literature studies too?
It seems so. We mentioned Yamagasoko before. His historical writings cited old documents focusing on evidence. R.A. Hakuseki wrote a famous history, the Dokushi Yoran, offering a kind of analytical take on the rise of the warrior class.
So more critical analysis.
Yes. And in literature, you had scholars like the monk Kichu studying the Manyoshu, that ancient poetry collection. He argued against reading poems just for moral lessons, trying to understand them on their own terms.
Getting closer to the text itself.
Right. And Kitamura Keegan did similar work with classics like The Tale of Genji, trying for a freer interpretation. It sort of paves the way for later Kokugaku national studies.
Okay, fascinating. Now, let's talk about what maybe the average townsperson was enjoying. Popular culture really exploded, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This is where you really see the townspeople's influence. Literature, written for them, about them, flourished. Take haikai, the linked verse form.
Basho's territory. Right?
Exactly. Before Basho, there was a more playful style, the Danrin style. But Matsuo Basho, he really elevated it. He brought in concepts like Yugen subtlety, profoundness, and Kanjaku quiet serenity.
And his travels were important.
Hugely. His journey recorded in Oku no Hosamichi, the narrow road to the deep north, is maybe the most famous example. His experiences directly fed into his poetry.
Such iconic work. And then there was Ihara Saikaku. He wrote novels.
That's right. Saikaku started with haikai, but then switched to prose fiction, these novels called Ukiyo-e, Stories of the Floating World.
What were they about?
All sorts of things reflecting town life. Amorous adventures, like in the life of an amorous man, but also the nitty-gritty of merchant life. Making money, losing money. Works like The Japanese Family Storehouse give you a real feel for the economic pulse of the era.
So literature reflecting their world back at them? What about theater?
Theater was massive. Puppet theater, ninyo-jori, and kabuki. Chikamatsu Manzemon is the giant here, writing brilliant plays for both forms.
What kind of plays?
He wrote Soamano domestic dramas, often based on real-life events like sensational love suicides. The love suicides at Sonozaki was a huge hit.
Wow, based on real events.
Often, yes. And he also wrote Jidaimono, historical epics. His battles of Kaksinga apparently ran for 17 months straight.
Incredible run. And kabuki.
Kabuki had become an all-male art form by then, Yaro Kabuki. It was incredibly popular urban entertainment. You had star actors like Ichikawa Danjuro and Ito and Sakata Tajuro and Kamigata, who were celebrities.
Like movie stars today, almost.
In a way, yes. Huge followings.
I was writing and performing. It must have needed publishers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is when commercial publishing really takes off as an industry. Kyoto was the early center.
And Saikaku helped fuel that.
Definitely. His ukiyo-zoshi, starting with Koshoku Ichidai Otoko in 1682, were bestsellers. It spurred growth. And publishers like Hachimanji Hachizemon in Kyoto became dominant, especially with their Hachimanji Bon books.
How many books are we talking about?
It's hard to know exactly, but one catalog from 1692 listed 7,200 titles. Estimates suggest maybe over 10 million individual books were circulating during Genroku.
10 million. That's staggering for woodblock printing. Were they expensive?
Oh, yes. Sakaku's novel might cost the equivalent of, say, 5,000 yen today. Quite a bit.
So how did ordinary people read them?
Lending libraries, kashihonya, they became super important. Kyoto had maybe 200 during Genroku, and even more later in Edo and Osaka. It really helped spread readership.
A key part of the cultural diffusion, then. Did the government try to control this boom?
They did. Regulations started gradually, but by the Kyoho reforms later on, things got more formal. Publishers formed associations. And in 1722, clear rules came out.
What kind of rules?
No criticizing the shogunate, nothing considered disruptive to public morals, and you had to put the authors' and publishers' names on the book. Control generally tightened over time.
Makes sense from their perspective. And publishing eventually shifted towards Edo.
Yeah, around the Tonuma era, later in the 18th century, Edo's publishing scene overtook Kyoto and Osaka's. Publishers like Tsutaya became huge there.
Okay, let's turn to visual arts.
Yeah.
We know Ukiyo-e is coming, but what else is happening?
Well, the flashy, opulent style from the Momoyama period hadn't completely disappeared. You see it in things like the Nikko Toshogu shrine, incredibly elaborate, built by the shogunate.
Right, the mausoleum. Very grand.
Very. And the Kano school of painters, they were still the official painters for the shogunate and lords. Kano Tanyu was the big name there.
But there was also a more refined taste.
Yes, definitely. Art connected to the traditional court culture continued. The Katsura detached palace is a prime example. Elegant, incorporating tea house aesthetics, that Sukiya-zukuri style. Very sophisticated.
And we have some standout individual artists.
Oh, for sure. Honami Koetsu, active a bit earlier but influential into this period, a real Renaissance man based in Kyoto painting, lacquer, ceramics, calligraphy. Amazing talent.
Multi-talented.
And Touraya Satatsu, who developed this really decorative, beautiful style based on older traditions. Then, right in the Genroku era, Ogata Korin emerges.
Very famous.
Very. Master painter, calligrapher, lacquer artist. He took Satatsu's style and made it bolder, even more decorative. This became the Rinpa school style, hugely popular with the wealthy merchants.
What are some famous Rinpa works?
So Tatsu's Wind God and Thunder God screens are iconic, and Korin famously painted his own version, plus his amazing irises screens. Instantly recognizable style.
Bold and beautiful. Okay, now, ukiyo-e.
Right, the pictures of the floating world. This was the new art form, really capturing the spirit of the townspeople. Hishikawa Maranobu is the key early figure.
What did he depict?
The life of Edo people, fashion, scenes from the pleasure quarters. His work defined early ukiyo-e. Original paintings were expensive, of course.
But he used printing.
Exactly. He pioneered using woodblock printing, not just for book illustrations, but for single sheet prints. This meant they could be mass-produced cheaply.
Making art accessible.
Hugely accessible. Suddenly, ordinary townspeople could own art. Moronobu's Beauty Looking Back is probably his most famous single print.
A real democratization of art. Were there developments in crafts, too?
Yes. In ceramics, after Kakimon perfected red-enameled porcelain in Arita, Kyoto saw masters like Ninsei no Nomura and Ogata Kenzan Korin's brother creating really refined pottery.
Beautiful pottery.
And textiles. Miyazaki Yuzen, also in Kyoto, developed Yuzen dyeing. This technique allowed for really vibrant pictorial designs on silk, became super fashionable.
So much creativity. But let's ground this a bit. What was actual daily life like? Was everyone living this vibrant, floating world life?
That's a crucial point. No, not everyone. Wealthy merchants, yes, they could afford the silk clothes with fancy Genroku patterns, live in nice houses, go to the theater.
But for others?
For lower-class townspeople, life was harder. And for farmers, it was often extremely harsh. They lived under tight controls, their clothing was basic hemp or cotton, diet mainly cheap grains, simple housing.
A very different reality.
Very different. The prosperity and cultural boom were real, but they weren't experienced equally across society. Traditional village life and customs were still dominant for the majority in the countryside.
That's important context.
Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap things up, the Genroku era was undeniably dynamic. A cultural explosion fueled by peace and merchant wealth.
We saw new ways of thinking, from official Neo-Confucianism to alternative schools like Kogogaku. We saw popular literature and theater boom with figures like Basho, Saikaku, and Shikamatsu.
And incredible art, from the decorative Rinpa school to the accessible world of ukiyo-e prints. Plus, a burgeoning publishing industry making it all circulate.
It really reshaped Japan's cultural landscape. The focus on learning, the appreciation for arts and entertainment, but also remembering the vastly different lives people led depending on their social class. It's a complex picture.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about. This Genroku focus on realism, on enjoying the floating world, the here and now, how might that have subtly shifted attitudes?
That's a great question. Could this celebration of urban life, of individual pursuits, even if just artistic or commercial, have planted seeds for later challenges to the established order? Was this focus on the present a quiet precursor to bigger social and political changes down the line?
Something for you all to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Genroku era.
See you next time on Learn Japanese History.